What's going on? Hope everybody's doing well. Today's episode, I'll be sharing with you guys a brand new Q&A with an individual who's already been on the channel before. It's my coach known as Conor Harris. I'm super happy to have him on the channel today. He's taught me so much. Like I mentioned in one of my previous episodes, my 12K sub celebration. This is my coach. This is a course I'm taking from the Pinnacle Performance website. I'm getting a lot of value, and I'm going to be sharing it right back to you guys. So this is the man himself. Super happy to have him on for a second time. And for all of you guys who haven't already watched the first episode, the first Q&A I've had with him on this channel, definitely recommend you check it out, and you'll be more familiar with some of the terms we're talking about. So welcome aboard.
Thanks for having me, Phil. Man, I'm so excited to do this. And it's been such a journey since we started working together. And to see how far you've come, and it's helped myself as a coach, honestly, selfishly. And it's just been an incredible, I think, growth journey for both of us, man. I've really enjoyed working with you, and I'm glad we're doing this.
Yeah, man. Everything happens for a reason, man. I had to work with a lot of coaches before. Shout out to Rich Staw. That's my coach right before you. But I've also worked with other coaches before. And yeah, it's been a long ride, man. It's been a rocky road, and it's gonna keep staying rocky, but it's getting better, you know?
Yeah, man.
So for all of you who are curious, the last Q&A we're talking about PRI, which basically stands for Postural Restoration Institute. We're talking about imbalances, some of the natural asymmetries of the body, such as the left AIC pattern. We're talking about posture. We spoke about myths in the training world, such as, you need to row more than you press, stuff of that nature, and a lot more. So definitely you should check that out. And so now we're at the part 2. Super happy. So let's dive into it. So first things first, what drives you to become a coach? Because you see a lot of people who get into this industry for very, I don't want to say selfish reasons, but they're very, most lifters, they're insecure about themselves, and they start lifting, and, they get stronger, they get some muscle. And then a lot of them say, hey, I might as well become a personal trainer now because I'm at the gym all the time. So what was kind of like your experience as a coach? How did you get into the industry?
It's funny. It's exactly that. I was born with pectus excavatum, which is like a slightly caved in rib cage. So I was very, very self-conscious from a very young age. And
wow.
The only thing that I knew how to, make it less obvious was to, get some pecs and get some biceps and get some delts. So I started just training, and then before I knew it, I was a senior in high school, and I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. So I was like, well, exactly like you said, I'm in the gym anyway, so let's just do this. And I don't know if something just caught on, and I really fell in love with it because I got deeper into it, right? I got past the, personal trainer certification where you learn just very basic things. And I got deeper into it through the help of people that, really reached out to help me and did me a lot of favors and were very generous. So being able to work with these people and under them was pretty much the thing that made me passionate about what I am, because I just fed off of their energy and I saw what they were talking about. And through practice and repetition, I just became hopefully somewhat proficient at it. And I've just been digging down the rabbit hole ever since of just the human body. And it's an incredible thing. And I'll never know all of it, but it's really cool. And I think it's similar. A lot of coaches get in the field because either they were in pain or they had something going on, and then training fixed it. And now they want to share that with others, and they want to help them succeed in the same way they did. So it's kind of similar to me in that regard.
Right. So let's rewind a little bit more. Like when you first stepped foot into the gym, was it more you just mentioned it was the pectus, but who were your influences? Like, did you watch any YouTube fitness at all?
Yeah.
Were you like one of those Scooby guys, or?
Yeah. Like Omar Isuf was my guy. I would watch him all the time. Greg Knuckles. I would read his Stronger by Science articles all the time. Bodybuilding.com. Went on those forums all the time. I spent so much time on that website. T-Nation. Yeah, T-Nation was another good one. But just kind of like that kind of mid 2000s kind of online training atmosphere is where I started off. And it was just it was very broy. It was very, which there's nothing wrong with that. And I just wanted to get deeper. I wanted to understand the intricacies of everything. So that stuff is still super fun to me today. But I try to, take a lot of tools and put them in my toolbox. And that's kind of how I got to the path I'm on today.
I love it, man. So as far as PRI is concerned, what drew you to this realm of fitness?
It was totally accidental. So I had a really bad ego sumo deadlifting injury. My left SI just gave out one day. And I was battling this for months and months. And I went and I did my first real internship in the field, where it was a private training facility in the capital of Oregon, which is Salem. So it was unpaid. And I walked in and the guy was like, everything you're doing for your back right now is wrong. And I was like, what? So I didn't really believe him at first, but then he showed me his methodologies and explained it to me. I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So I was doing all these things that weren't making me better. They were pushing me further into where I was. And it wasn't until I, thankfully he just changed my opinion through just logic and, helping me feel better. And then I was like, oh, there's something to this. And that goes back to, finding something that works well. And you want to help other people find that same experience. So I went and I did a couple other internships, and then I graduated from college, and I was like, well, I can go and I can, try and be like a D1 strength coach and climb that ladder, or I can go and learn more about this PRI stuff and like this this total global approach to the body and the brain and the mind and everything. And so I went and sought that out. And then I spent about 2 years studying that over in North Carolina. Recently moved back to Oregon, where once COVID's over, I hopefully will open up my own facility, and that'll be a lot of fun. And I'm really looking forward to that, but we don't know when that's going to happen, right? So I'm waiting for things to open up. Oregon's a little bit further behind than other states in terms of opening things up. So I think it's probably going to be, summer next year. But until then, I'll be doing the online thing and training people online. And I think I'll always do that. But to some extent, I do want to train people in person, and I miss that.
Yeah, so much more bang for your buck when you're actually face to face,
Right.
But like guys like you still get the job done like online.
Yeah, it's actually made me a better coach, honestly, because if you can coach someone through things online, in person, it's just so easy.
Right.
Because online, you can't get near them. You have to change the position of the camera every 5 seconds. And you just got to, it's a process you got to learn through. But if you can get someone to feel these things and get positions that are better and improve their goals and reach their goals, then, man, doing it in person, I can't imagine it can be any harder.
Of course. It's annoying to tell the person, hey, you mind moving your webcam here and here, whereas like in person you could just walk around them and like, yeah. But I'm assuming when you first started studying PRI, it wasn't as popular as it is today.
No, it was. I think at the time, this was probably 5 years ago now. It was not popular at all. I think there's a certification you can get called a PRT or a PRC. That means you've gone through their certification process. I think there was, less than, in terms of like as a strength and conditioning coach, you get your PRT. So I think there was like less than 20 in the world. And now there's, I think, well over 100. And online, it's really starting to pick up steam, like the 90-90 hip lift. You see that everywhere. And that was a PRI thing that really got that going. And that's kind of stems from their practices and methodologies. But you see it all the time now. And that's something that is working its way into powerlifting communities, bodybuilding communities. It's just cool to see. It really is.
Yeah, the same thing with the all fours.
Exactly. Yeah, the all four breathing.
Side lying, all that stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I noticed on your website and on your Twitter that you seem to be working with like some basketball guys.
Mm-hmm.
Females too, but I noticed with the post you made yesterday, you look pretty tall too, man. So it's like, do you have like a basketball background too, or?
It's funny. Basketball is my favorite sport to play and to watch, but it's also probably in terms of my athletic ability, the least, the one I'm probably the worst at. So it's funny. My athletic background is I was good at golf. I was okay at football, and I was really bad at basketball, but I love basketball. So it's just, I try to stay connected to the sport because I love it so much and I know the mechanics of it. Just myself, I'm just not the best at it.
Okay. I guess because I saw you last Q&A with like the Trailblazers hoodie.
Yeah.
Like in the course, you mentioned like Curry and like you mentioned other players and your certain stances and athletic ability. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I played basketball too, man. That's actually how I tore my ACL, man.
Oh, really?
The left ACL, yeah, yeah.
Oh,
20
yeah.
in 2016, 2017, like very late 2016.
Were you playing pickup or what?
Stupidest story, man. Basically, I was playing American with like a bunch of guys and like like free for all. It wasn't even like a serious like pickup game of five. It was just like American.
Hmm.
And like usually I don't play American if there's over like 15 people or like 10 people. Just crowded. It's like a mosh pit, bro. Everyone's
Hmm.
just playing on one net. Um, you know what I'm talking about, right? There's just one net. It's everyone all for
Yeah.
themselves and stupid. Like even if you win, like it doesn't really matter anyways.
Right.
And yeah, basically it doesn't really matter. But I jumped in the air, landed on my left foot, tore the ACL, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But we're gonna dive into like ACL stuff later on in the Q&A. But I just find it so funny how I remember just on a quick note, I was talking to so many people when I tore it about their experiences with their ACL, and even until this day, like 4 years later, I've never met one person in my life who had a right ACL surgery. Every single one of them was on the
Really?
left side.
You
Yeah, I'm
know?
sure I'm sure they exist,
Oh,
but I've
yeah.
never
But
met them myself. Like
I actually think that lines up well with, I mean, I've seen right ACLs, but I think I've seen way more lefts.
I've never seen one right, man. But at the same time, like I've probably spoken to like maybe like 15 people. You probably spoken to like hundreds, so it's like no
Yeah, it's a
comparison.
it's a common injury, but yeah, that is interesting. I've never thought of it that way.
Okay, so besides like the pec test that you had, and the thing regarding the sumo deadlift, like what were some other big challenges regarding like imbalances that you had to go through? Like we spoke last time about the left AIC. Were you really like in this pattern like heavily, or were you ever like a patho PC or?
Yeah, so I guess like people listening to this of like, well, what are those things? Well, when you deadlift and you squat and you do all these barbell movements, and what are you taught? Like, what do you see online for cues? It's chest up, butt back, and that puts a big arch in your low back. And when you continually lift with this big arch in your low back, which is great for stability and being strong. If you want to be strong, you probably need to do that. But if you're stuck there, like I was, then your pelvis becomes forward. Is there going to be a video of this?
No.
No? Okay. Well,
I,
just
I,
imagine
I
a
could throw it in.
pelvis.
Yeah, I could throw it in. Yeah.
Sure. Imagine, like, for the people that are watching, imagine a pelvis and it dumps forward. Both of the pelvic halves come forward, and then you're kind of stuck there. And that was me. And so when I went to, I went to sumo deadlift one day, I was doing a heavy triple, and I was going for, I was just going to try and squeeze it out because I knew it was going to be hard. And I belted up and I went for it. And that was just the last straw. I didn't listen to my body. I'd had a little achy SI joint within the last month. I just didn't listen to it. So I just went for it. It popped. And to this day, that if I'm going to hurt in one area of my body, it's going to be that left SI. But at least now I know
Wow.
how to manage it. But like these injuries, man, they stem from relatively predictable overuse of positions. And the goal is not to get out of those positions all the time. It's just, can you get out? Can you leave that huge back arch and extension on the platform? Can you leave it in the gym and then go and live your life and not be stuck there? That's what it's about.
Right. So last time we spoke about the all fours 90-90 side lying drills, and you said that on day one for a lot of individuals, this is where you're gonna start.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna start with a basic 90-90 all fours, and we're trying to get sagittal plane competency. So let's just say someone's been doing a lot of these drills for a very long time, for maybe a couple months now. What are some ways you would like to progress them? Because I see guys like Kyle Dobbs, other individuals of that nature, they'll start adding like bands into it for more reach. So they'll maybe start adding, yeah, I'll see a lot of bands, and
Yeah.
various other tools, maybe like a kettlebell that they'll like drag on one side to the other on the all fours. So what's your progression like?
So I think I look at it two ways. Like, no one wants to do corrective exercise all the time. So like if you're lifting weights, you're trying to get strong or big or whatever, you don't want to lay on the ground and roll around and breathe all the time. Like, I would rather someone get this variability, the ability to, get out of these positions and their accessory exercises if I can. So you're going to go back squat, great. Well, maybe an accessory can be a Zercher squat, because that's going to put you in more of that posterior pelvic tilt where you tuck your hips back and you keep your rib cage over your pelvis and you're not arching your back, because you can't, because the weight of the bar is in your elbows, right? Pulling you down. So you have to stay stacked. And when I say stacked, I mean rib cage over a neutral pelvis. That's not too arched or forward. So that would be a good way to get you out of that pattern, but still give you, a quad pump, still give you a hamstring, like a ton of hamstrings, still give you a ton of abs. So I think that's more conducive to someone who wants to become stronger or bigger, rather than laying on the ground and breathing. But if someone is so far deep in their pattern that they need to do that, then I will probably start them off with lots of references, meaning their body is touching lots of other things. So when you're in an all fours position, a quadruped position, your hands are on the ground, your knees are on the ground, your feet are on the ground. When you're in a supine 90-90, your feet are on a wall and your entire back's against the ground. So there's a lot of stuff touching other stuff. And my goal is to eventually get people upright and moving and maintaining these positions. So I'm eventually going to take references away. I'm going to take, for example, you from that supine position and flip you on your side, because you have less things touching other things. There's less stability. Then I'm going to get you in like a half kneeling position, then maybe a tall kneeling, then maybe a split stance, right, then maybe one leg, then maybe walking or doing some movement with it. So that's my goal, is to just remove references, make that person stabilize in these new positions. So you can do that with bands too, to add resistance. But ultimately, my goal is to do as little corrective exercise and just, have them lift and get something out of it as well. So they'll be more bought in.
Right. So they're not just doing like all these too many corrective drills.
Right.
But a lot of the corrective drills are already implemented into the exercises.
Exactly.
Right. So Conor has a lot of free webinars you could check out. I'll post a link to one of them if it's requested enough in the comment section below. And he talks about force plates. He talks about how you put a lot of athletes on these force plates and they tell you how much of their weight they're shifting onto one side. And this helps buy-in. And this helps basically convince certain people that, hey, you may need to get a bit more into your left side, stuff of that nature. He talks in these webinars about the natural asymmetries of the body. He talks about the left AIC pattern, which was spoken about in the last Q&A. So the question is, do you find that sometimes telling somebody about these asymmetries, these natural asymmetries of the body, could actually be counterproductive? For example, maybe they feel good, and then just kind of putting that in their head, now they're kind of looking at their left side a little bit differently. Has that ever happened to you?
Well, I mean, we can both speak from experience on that. Once you're aware of it, you can't unsee it, because you see it everywhere, because it's just being a human being. If you're a human being and your heart was you were born with your heart on the left side of your body, and then you have all your organs in this orientation that we're all born in, except for a very, very small percentage of the population, you are going to be more prone to be in your right hip, even if you're left-handed. And that's because of all these different asymmetries we have going on within our brain, our organs, our skeletal position, all these things. So because of this bias, people, don't really believe it at first. So you have to give them a tool. That's what I like to use the force plate for. So I'll have them do a bodyweight squat or an overhead squat, or just literally anything on two legs in a bilateral symmetrical stance. And they'll see every single time that they have more weight on their right heel than they do on their left. Usually it's somewhere between 60 and 70%. So I like to use these as hey, this is a real thing. I'm not making this up. The only time you ever see people lean on their left side is when they're compensated, right? So maybe they're so unstable, they either unconsciously feel like they're in their right side so much, so they kind of shift over to the left, or they've had, previous injuries like a right ACL tear, for example, and now they're in their left hip. But there's always this slight degree of underlying right bias. That's why you see so many people with a more winged scapula that's poking out on the right. That's why you see people with more right shoulders that are lower than left. And once you see it, it's hard not to, unsee it. And I guess people listening to this are going to start noticing that now. But if someone's healthy, I don't care. And I'm not going to tell them that, because why? If it's not broke, don't fix it, you know? So if
Right.
I've got a power lifter that has no really big red flags in their movement and they're making progress and feeling good, then why would I bring it up? You know, why give them one more thing to think about?
Right. So in that case, you'd like put the force plate to the side and just, it's not broken, so let's not fix it. Yeah.
Exactly.
So on that same topic, because I know a lot of people are thinking, hey, well, with these natural asymmetries we're talking about, and how a lot of people, they do tend to like, be more in the right hip, tend to like shift more weight in their right heel. If they're doing like a squat, in many cases, at least from the cases I've seen and the cases that a lot of other coaches have seen, they do tend to hip shift on that right side.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen a lot of YouTubers on who lift who shift on the right side as well. But you also hear people make the argument, well, I'm left-handed.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, if I'm left-handed and I'm doing a lot of stuff with my left hand, wouldn't that counteract that? So and also like to add a bit more to the question,
Mm-hmm.
would it be beneficial for people to be left-handed due to a lot of the asymmetries that we have?
So that's a really good question, and that is the common follow-up to all this. Well, what if you're left-handed? Well, you were still born with your heart on the left side of your body. You were still born with a liver, which is a huge organ that's packed on your right side. You were still born with a brain that has been shown to have more ability to sense the right side. There's more motor neurons on the left side of the brain that goes to the right side of the body. So there's all these factors that are pushing us into our right side. Our diaphragm is bigger on the right than the left. So we have a lot of things pushing us into the right side. But if you're left-handed, then one of two things usually happens. Because we're prone to be in the right side, they might want to be in their left side a little bit more. So they get in their left side, but because of these underlying asymmetries, it can be hard for them to be really truly effective in their right hip then. So maybe they're not great in their right hip because they've kind of rewired their brain to want to be in the left side more. Or they're not good in either hip necessarily because of this underlying bias. But sometimes it does help to be left-handed. For example, I am a lefty golfer and also I swing left-handed in baseball. So if I'm going to shift into my left hip, I have an easier sense of doing that than probably the average person. I don't know because I'm not other people. But I just, from what I see, people that are left-handed have an ability to shift into their left side better. But sometimes, and not always, that comes at the expense of not being great in your right side either.
Right. It's very interesting stuff, man. When we start like looking at it a lot more. And even me, like in my everyday life, like let's say if I'm downtown or something and I see like a group of people or I'm at work, see a group of guys, whatever, I always notice that majority of the group is sitting into their right heel.
Yeah. Yeah, like if you're listening to this right now, next time it's socially acceptable to be within like a circle of human beings and like a social circle and talk, try this. So when at first, stand on your right leg, find your right heel and turn your pelvis to the right, and then just have a conversation with someone. Then in the middle of that conversation or in another new conversation, do the opposite. Get on your left heel and then turn your pelvis to the left and trunk to the right. So you're kind of set up with like your pelvis pointing left, but your chest is facing forward. That is almost always more awkward for people. Watch speakers talk when they're trying to seek comfort, right? Because they're speaking in front of a lot of people. They will naturally sit in their right side because that's where they're comfortable. That's home base. You know what I mean?
And the key word is uncomfortable because that's especially when they're uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. So they seek stability. Yeah.
They feel more grounded. They feel more at home. And I know Neil Hallinan talks a lot about this. How do I say this? How a lot of people are like, oh, I'm not stuck in right stance. I could get into left stance. Then he mentions how a lot of times it's fake left stance, where they'll get into left stance, but the left knee is locked. Yeah. And I at certain periods, I thought that I was able to really get into left stance as well until I really started diving more into his work. And I realized how unstable I really was on the left side. And all that would do was I would put my right foot a little bit more in front of my left. not by too much, by like maybe half a foot or something, half an actual foot. I would unlock the left knee. I would do like a little hip hike on the left side, and like I felt way less. It felt good to know that like okay, I could kind of get there, but it felt bad to know that I wasn't that stable as stable I was on the right side.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I noticed a lot of people like I'll tell people like hey like I'll just explain it to certain people with like the new concepts I'm learning. And a lot of times they'll tell me like I could get left stance easy, but the left knee's locked.
Yeah, exactly. And when your knee is locked, where is your weight going? On your toe, at least more forward on your foot. And your pelvis comes forward on that side when you lock out your knee like that. So, I mean, really, yeah, you're on your left leg, but you're not in your left hip. You're not really feeling your left heel. You're not really feeling your left hamstring. When the pelvis is forward in this position, the quad on the left tends to want to take over more than the quad on the right. So we kind of have this like asymmetrical muscle bias where the muscles that shift us into our right hip become tight, and the muscles that push us out of our left hip become tight. And then the inverse is true in terms of like getting us in our left hip are long, and then the muscles that push us out of our right side are long. So if you're going to jump off of one leg, I pulled Twitter and I got 800 something responses, and I was like, hey, which leg are you going to jump off of when you do a single leg plyo? And 52% of people said the left side. But that doesn't make sense if you think about the way that people are right side dominant. Now, there's a bunch of other factors that go into this. So maybe, for example, you played basketball when you grew up, and for a right hand layup, you jumped off your left leg. And that's just kind of how you're used to doing things. That is entirely valid, and that is absolutely a factor in this. So I'm not saying this is the only factor, but I think it's pretty clear through this discrepancy that we have this natural ability to push off of our left side easier.
Mm-hmm. So just diving deeper into this, I know you've mentioned this in previous podcasts. What are some other things with what you know now that you tend to notice that a lot of people don't notice during their everyday lives? So you see the person downtown, he's in his right hip. What are some other things you tend to notice that are very subtle?
I would encourage people to take off their shoes and look at their feet and stand and have someone take a picture of both of their arches. The right foot tends to have a higher arch than the left because we sit in our right hip. The right side is more turned in, so the ankle turns out more, whereas it's the opposite on the left. Usually you see the left side, things are turning out, so the ankle turns in to find stability. So the arch is usually higher on the right than the left. Think about what side you chew your food on. I bet most people would say the right side. Think about what side you want to, like if you're going to lay on one side, it's going to be your right side or your left side. And just think about, I don't know, for example, this is one I see that people don't realize is when people are bench pressing or squatting. And they're always looking down because, that gives them, a sense of the floor and it helps them feel stable. But when, when crap really hits the fan and it gets really hard and they're really trying to push through, their eyes tend to go right because that is where they feel stable. Or they'll turn their head to the left because that's where they feel stable. So their right eye is forward more. It's people like to turn their head to the left, so their right eye, which is kind of the dominant eye in many cases, tends to take over. So turning their head to the left in that squat, deadlift, whatever heavy lift they're doing, tends to allow them to feel more stable, and it's completely subconscious.
Wow. Yeah, it gets deep, man.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about athletes, a lot of the athletes that you work with. So we just spoke about analyzing, just everyday average Joes in the real world. Let's talk about athletes on the field, or let's say the first day of tryouts. Over the course of time, what are some things that you've noticed with certain athletes where, just without even looking at them for too long, that this is a good athlete right here. This guy for sure has a great athletic background. And I'm not going to get into which sport because that's obviously different. I know that you're going to need different strengths for different sports, but let's just say for the sake of example, basketball.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you know from the get-go, you look at the guy, like, he's a good player? And on the opposite side of things, how do you know that, okay, this guy probably is, he might get cut from the team, or he's not the most athletic, or we might not need him?
There's a couple of things. If I assess this individual, and I'll get to like some easier tells, but if I assess this individual and I know this can sound crazy to some people, but the tests where I put someone on a table and assess their range of motion, which is really assessing the ability for them to expand and compress their body. If they can do both of those things, those people, I would say 9 times out of 10 are better athletes than the ones that don't pass those tests, or they don't have an ability to get out of that state like I was talking about earlier with that low back arch, and you're in this fight. That's a fight or flight response in your body, which is great, and you need that. But if you can't get out of that, that can have detrimental effects. So if someone can, get in each hip, and I assess them and they can do that, and they can expand and compress their body, their rib cage, then those people tend to move really well because there's no limitations. If you can go into internal rotation, external rotation, adduction, abduction, flexion, and extension when you need to, then your body has no reason to compensate most of the time, unless you have some like vision issues or other things. But really, I see it time and time again. And I know some people that have worked with professional athletes who would say the same thing, that are familiar with the tests that I would use, and they use them as well. So it really is. That is my biggest tell, and it's not always accurate, but I say 9 times out of 10 you do see that. But just right away, you can kind of get a sense for people that move well, right? Like you can just get a sense for someone, and there's a lot of genetic factors that play into this. Like, was it nature, nurture? I don't know. No one knows. But you can just see the way someone can control their body. Like, look at LeBron James and compare him to Derrick Rose, who's also an exceptional athlete. But Derrick Rose had very little control of his fall, very little ability to hit the ground and absorb that force. He's very stiff. Whereas LeBron, for whatever reason, can easily absorb that force. That's why he doesn't get hurt very much. He had like one serious injury in his whole career, and that was last season where he had that like groin thing for a month. And I don't even know if that's serious. But the guy just doesn't really get hurt, because he can both expand and compress. Expansion is absorbing force. Compression is producing force. But if you can only produce force, which is stiffness in your body, and you hit the ground and you're in this compressed state, then you can't absorb that force. So where's the force going to go? It's going to dissipate through your entire body, your stiff body, when you hit the ground, and then your ACL's gone. Or something else happens over time with repetitive stress.
Right. And Derrick Rose, I've been watching basketball in forever, and Derrick Rose, I remember he had a couple injuries.
Yeah.
Pretty sure he had a knee surgery too, no?
Yeah, he tore his ACL, then he tore his other one, then he tore his other one again. So he just started compensating, right? Once injuries pile up, your body's trying to take the path of least resistance. And I think most people know this. Everything's connected. Like everything is connected. Your neck is going to influence what your foot does, and vice versa. It's constantly going up and down, top down, bottom up. And if you take one thing out of that, then your brain is going to sense that. Your body's going to sense that. So it's going to make up for that in the way it knows best, because your body is only really concerned about survival. That's all it cares about, is can I complete this task without burning the most calories? Because that's how we survived when we were like hunters and gatherers, right? For so much of our species history, we were always trying to, conserve the most amount of energy for, the most amount of results. That's why, like, for example, your butt shoots back in a squat when it's really heavy, because that's your body self-organizing into the path of least resistance. We're stronger in a hinge than a squat. It's going to cost you less calories, and it's going to give you a higher chance of success if you hinge in that heavy squat than if you were to maintain absolutely perfect form and come up. Your body doesn't know what perfect form is. It knows what is the easiest way for me to complete this task and get rid of this threat.
Right. That's also why you got a lot of guys who could like low bar squat a huge amount, and you put them on a front squat and they're not like, there's like a major gap of strength.
Yeah.
Or you put them, got a lot of like low bar squatters who do like a real high bar, like they're not as strong. Like maybe they're just really, yeah. So let's talk about more lifters in the gym. Right? This could actually like relate to athletes too. But people who let's say they train a lot, they do a lot of like, stationary sagittal plane lifts in the gym, and they want to start getting a bit more athletic, if you will. They want to start doing more, moving their body through space. Like I'm talking like box jumps, they want to do like throws, medicine ball throw. They want to do different kind of throws and jumps, just for this example.
Sure.
And they've never done any of this before in their life, and now they're working with a coach, like you, for example. Where would you start some of these guys off on day one?
So I do low amplitude, like little, if they want to do like plyometrics, they want to jump, and I would do low amplitude, like pogo hops, like literally just hopping in place, feeling the ability to be springy. Because if you spend a lot of time in a gym, you spend a lot of time producing force but not absorbing it. So if I were to have this person, take a step off a box and do a jump, oh boy, that's a recipe for a disaster. So I like to follow the progression of, you start them off with like hops in place, then you jump up to a box because that dampens the impact, and then you progressively increase the height of the box, and then you can have them do, like, for example, like lateral bounds, like skater jumps, for example. You're jumping side to side, things that are going to allow them to be athletic and feel athletic but not put their body at risk. Because if they were to do intense tons of jumping, that would be absolutely a recipe for disaster if they had no previous exposure to those things. But I think they're great things to do because you're getting different adaptations from those things than you are when you lift weights. So, and it doesn't need to be a lot. Like even if you just did 3 sets of 5 box jumps and as part of your the final part of your warm up, that would give you those adaptations. You don't have to be out there doing 2 minutes of repetitive box jumps. You're no longer being explosive at that point. You're just doing risky cardio because you take one misstep, and that's a lot of stress on your body as well.
So while we're on the topic of box jumps, before we get into the throws, you see a lot of people who turn this into like an all-out.
Yeah.
It's kind of like who could get the knees higher.
Who can get their knees to their neck the easiest? That's not a box jump, right? Like that's just how much can you get your knees to your neck? And that's a Pat Davidson quote. So I didn't make that up, but I love it. So it really, if you do a box jump and your knees are higher than the level of your hips when you land, that is not indicative of a good box jump. Because let's think about athletes. When they land, when LeBron lands after he hits the ground, is he, bringing his knees up to his belly button? No, you don't see that in athletics. Athletics is, you need to have stiffness, but you need to be able to absorb it. You don't want too much stiffness. So a real good box jump, you're going to land with your hips back and your knees are going to be a little bit below your hips. So if you can do that and do a box jump, feel free. But these crazy things you see on Instagram are people just pulling their knees up to their neck. It's just like, that's great. Like, what does that tell me about how explosive you are, other than you have a really good ability to get your knees high?
Right. So you're very flexible, but there's diminishing returns to how high you set the box and what direction to get out of it, and also the injury risk that you can get from it.
Right.
But you see certain people do it on like foam boxes, like they're very like soft kind of boxes. Yeah. It kind of makes a difference, no? Or you say like would you say someone's picking straws, like if they're kind of like,
if it's a soft box, I feel like that's potentially risky as well, because that's not really like when you land on the ground, you want to have some degree of stiffness in the box you're jumping up to, because it's got to act as the ground to some degree. If you're jumping up on like a foam box, that could dampen the impact. Right. You could feel unstable. But I think regardless of what implement you're using for that box, you just need to make sure that you're not using too much ego. And I think people are aware of this now. If you jump that high on a box, like, is it really that impressive? I don't know, like probably not. But that could just be me talking to a lot of strength and conditioning coaches. So I don't know, maybe it is still impressive, but it's not really, it's not indicative of how high your vertical jump is. Right.
And as far as when you jump onto the box, you see this is done in different ways. Some people will just jump straight back down.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see other, like I saw a coach, Zach Evanesh, when he does his box squats, he's like a strength and conditioning coach. He'll jump on and then he'll kind of go down the step and he'll restart. What do you recommend? Or does it really matter?
Well, I think it depends on where you're at. Like if I had someone day one, they're walking down because if they stepped off that box, they can't absorb force quite well yet. So I'm having them step off. But it's just stress on your tissues, right? Like those impacts are much harder than people realize. Especially if you're on concrete or something like that, is tough on your tissues. So if you're going to do that over and over again, just spare yourself and, walk down. And that's going to allow you to do more box jumps. Not that you need that many, like really, like I said earlier, 3 sets of 5 is enough volume for you for a day for box jumps. Like as long as they're high quality, because what's the purpose of a box jump? To be explosive, to use that stretch shortening cycle and be elastic. But if you're doing, I don't know, like 50 reps of box jumps, at what point are you just not recruiting that in the best way you can? It's quality over quantity. That's why when you sprint, you don't want to do, you don't frequently want to do like 50-yard sprints, 40-yard sprints, and then rest 30 seconds and go again. The risk of hurting yourself due to compensation, due to fatigue, is just way too high. And it's really about quality. The more research that comes out about rest periods, the more it's like you'd rather be on the side of caution and rest way longer than you think you need to, as opposed to going back into it sooner than you think.
Right. I think an important thing regarding box jumps is a lot of people, they're under the impression that if they improve their box jump, they'll be able to like dunk.
Right. And
some people that don't care about basketball, man. They want to be able to just dunk a basketball,
Yeah.
They don't want to like try out for any teams. They just want to have like maybe like an Instagram post just to say, oh, I'm dunking,
Yeah.
So I think the question is, and I know this is a very loaded question. People write books about this, like 500 pages about how to improve your vertical, but in a very like condensed answer, and from the people you've coached, not saying that you just coach people solely on how to improve their vertical either, but let's just say someone were to come to you and say, hey Conor, I need to improve my vertical. We got 6 months. Like, where would you start?
Well, let's think about what goes into a vertical jump. When you absorb and you're going down and you're going through that stress shortening cycle, you need to flex, right? Like you need to round your back to some extent, or I hope you do, because that allows you to absorb force. I'm not saying you need to look like a scared cat, but there is a degree of flexion and external rotation and abduction going on when you go down into that first portion. Then you quickly switch over to compressing and producing force and pushing force into the ground. And what happens is your guts, literally your guts, sink down as you go down. Then they spring up as you go up. And your guts are really kind of like a springboard for you to be able to produce force and jump up. But if they can't sink down and you can't flex and you can't allow that force absorption to happen, you're going to be limited. So that's why I think it's really important for people to have access to all these different joint ranges of motion, because I was amazed how much my vertical improved when I actually got access to those movements, when I actually restored my body to more of a quote unquote neutral state. I wasn't even training for it. And my vertical went up like, 3 or 4 inches. It was like, wow, I didn't even realize this was happening until one day I tried to grab rim and it was like really easy. Like, whoa. So hopefully that is like a little bit of a different perspective, because I think there is the traditional idea of training for power, right? Like those box jumps are great if executed well, and doing sort of like, I don't know, things like weighted, unweighted squats, pairing like a trap bar jump with a box jump, potentiating that and having those two things complement each other. Those things can be effective for training a vertical jump. You want to have some degree of strength, but at some point you have to turn that strength into explosive force. But if your body isn't ready to absorb the force, then you're inherently going to be limiting the amount of force you can produce. That's why I think it comes to so many things too, like with sprinters, people who want to be really fast. They always think more weight on the bar, get stronger, right? But what if we flipped it around, and maybe if you could absorb the force, then you could absorb the force quicker and then you could spend less time on the ground. You could produce more force into the ground, and then you can go faster. Because at some point, you're strong enough to be explosive and be an athlete. And it's actually a lot sooner, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many coaches that I talk to about this stuff, than people think.
And as far as testing, let's say a powerlifter, for example, like let's say someone just wants to improve their bench press 1 rep max, their big 3 or whatever. Like they have certain periods of their program where they'll test, or maybe on meet day they test it. How often would you test? I know certain coaches they'll have certain I don't know what it's really called, but a vertical jump when they kind of just slap the thing at the top.
Yeah.
Different ways to test it, but how often would you test one's vertical jump?
I think you can test it all the time, really. Like that's not something that's going to be, because really when you're jumping, I hope you're trying to jump high. So that's not going to be the same as like testing someone's 1 rep max squat, because that's going to gas their central nervous system. They're going to be fatigued from that. But just trying to do one jump as high as you can do that every single day if you wanted to.
Right. It's not as taxing.
No, it's just, you're, as long as you can land right, it's not taxing.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about throws now. Because you talk a lot about how we need sagittal plane competency first before we get into the fancy stuff, the frontal and transverse. And let's just say you got a guy who really wants to just throw stuff. He likes to, he sees people on Instagram, he sees like people doing like the medicine ball throws to the side, or throw like Highland games and stuff of that nature.
Sure.
Where would you start someone like that?
So if they want to produce force that way, then I'm going to start in the sagittal plane front to back. So maybe we do a medicine ball throw into a wall from our chest. Maybe you lay down on the ground and you try and throw that med ball as high as you can. And maybe I drop it off to you and you try and be reactive with it. But then I'm going to, it's all about references. That's how I progress exercises. Take references away. Less stuff of your body touching other stuff. So, for example, I might progress from the ground to a half kneeling position. And then you might do a half kneeling throw. Then I might get you up in a split stance, one leg in front of the other. Then I might add a step behind. So you're in that split stance, you step behind yourself, you go back into the split stance and you throw it against the wall. That's kind of how I progress things. And then maybe we end up doing overhead throws where you are dropping into a squat and then extending and jumping and throwing the ball as high or as far as you possibly can. And that stuff's fun. But med ball work is interesting because it really, people are good at it. Some people are not so good at it. So really it's one of those things where you just got to kind of see where someone's at. Some people just have a natural ability to throw a med ball better than other people, just like any other skill ever. And it really, like, the athletes tend to be better at them rather than someone who is a powerlifter. You'd think someone that's a powerlifter would be able to throw a med ball really well, but usually they're so stiff that they can't rotate enough. That's why we got to start in the sagittal, then half kneeling with rotation, then split stance with rotation. Mm-hmm. So we got to get them to loosen up, and med ball throwing is a good way to do that and still have some fun.
Right. So you're saying they go from the floor, they could do like kind of like a floor press position, push it up to like you're standing on like a block or something. Maybe you'll catch it, drop it down, and something like that.
Right.
And then from there, they could do like a half kneeling against like a wall, I'm assuming. Into like what, like a standing split stance, or like a standing.
Yeah. So like you just bring that foot off of or that knee off of the ground in a half kneeling position. Then I maybe have you do like let's say you could do like a fall through step, right? So maybe you take a step behind yourself from a static stance with your feet together, take a step behind yourself, and then throw that ball into the wall as you step through. That would be a way to add a dynamic component to a split stance. And then from there, I'd probably, throw in a little bit more rotational things where maybe you're doing slams from side to side. And then maybe we could even throw some med ball work into some runs, into some sprints. Maybe you can start from a kneeled position, throw the med ball and use that as an explosive tool to chase after that ball. And that stuff can be fun. And I think it's good too, because if you're only doing one thing all the time, if you're only barbell squatting, benching, and deadlifting, then your body's going to adapt to that. And then the second you try to do something else, you could potentially get injured, or you might not be as good at that because you've put so much input into your body of one thing, which is stiff, which is force production. There's nothing wrong with that. But if that's all you do, then your body is just going to adapt to the imposed demands put on it.
Like on a side note for what you just said, man, it pisses me off when people say I had a buddy of mine who sent me a message a couple months ago of a guy bench pressing. He benched like 405. And he was like a lightweight, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And he also told me like, well, man, put this guy in the ring. He's a monster, like a fighter,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And I told him like, look, it's specificity too, you know? If
Mm-hmm.
that was the case, then why even practice fighting at all? And just improve your bench, and you're gonna be a good fighter. Like it's not like you got some people who could bench crazy amounts of weight and who get
Yeah.
knocked out in one punch, you know.
Yeah.
And also when you're benching, it's like you're benching with two arms at the same time, for the
Right.
most part, at least in competition. But like nobody punches like that in the real like.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Think about
yeah,
this.
yeah.
Think about it this way. If you're going to, be really stiff, like a lot of people are who only train with the weights, and again, I'm not trying to demonize that. I'm just trying to use this as an example. If you get hit in the chin from the side, your neck is so stiff that your neck is not going to be able to turn with that punch and absorb that force. It can't flex because it's so extended and it's so tense. Then maybe when that strike comes and you can't turn your neck, where's the force going? Into your cranium, and then you're KO'd. So you've got to have a mobile neck. Like combat athletes are always like, I credit Bill Hartman. He actually answered this question for me, which makes a lot of sense. You don't necessarily want to have a super stiff neck if you're a combat athlete. You want to be able to absorb that force when you get hit. And that's going to allow you to then not have that force go directly into your, head and cranium. And then you're not going to have to black out, or you're not going to get KO'd, because you can absorb that force. And that's the name of the game if you're an MMA athlete, to be able to alternate between absorbing and producing force.
Right. I guess it comes down to variability at the end of the day, you know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm just tired of people saying like comparing fighting to lifting. It's not the same thing at all. Like
No,
you could be a strong power lifter, you could be like a jack bodybuilder. It does not mean you could fight.
not at all. Yeah.
And I think that if people could come more into peace with this, it'd be a good thing, you know, because it's not like, if anything, people lift weights because they know they can't fight.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally
You know?
understand.
I think everybody should like still like what you say, seek variability, you know, not to just be like this one-dimensional thing. Like there's nothing wrong with it either, but to still be good. Like I was actually gonna make a blog post a long time ago about this, how a reason you always hear about a lot of bodybuilders getting injured, you know.
Mm-hmm.
They bodybuild all their lives. Their friends tell them, hey, come play a pickup game of soccer, and they're so used to doing like
You cut out big time.
guys, you know, bear with us for a sec.
I lost you.
Yeah, you're there. I see you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now we're back.
Yeah. Okay, we're good. We're good. Yeah.
All right. We can just cut
To
that.
everybody who's been watching, you know, the whole time, man, you guys are the real MVPs. So, okay. So yeah, this Q&A is a lot like the questions are in no particular order. I just had a lot of questions for Conor. I'm just spewing them all. So one of the last ones for at least the athletic stuff is I read a post from the biomechanist on Instagram a couple weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
It said, "Run to get fit?" ? Then it said, "Get fit to run." So in other words, I'm assuming that he's saying that a lot of people have to kind of earn their way to run, as opposed to just like, because running can be technical too. So what are your thoughts on that statement?
Yeah, I mean, he's right. And that's, people think they can just get up off the couch and just go. And to some extent you can. And there's a lot of luck involved. So If you're someone who's relatively uninjured throughout your life, maybe you can alternate between walking and running to the point where you're running a lot. But the reason why people get hurt when they're just starting off, they're going from the couch and they're trying to run a mile or two, it's because they're deconditioned and they're doing one thing over and over again. They're doing a sagittal plane front to back motion, and that's all they're doing. So if you're continually putting that stress on your body, that impact forces, and maybe you're wearing crappy shoes, then it's just like the bodybuilder or powerlifter. You're just going to feed yourself too much of one thing, and you're deconditioned, so you're compensating because you can't keep up with it. And people, when they're running and they're doing aerobic work, it's amazing how quickly they get tired. And they don't even realize it. So they might think they're good for another mile, but in reality, they've already started compensating. They don't even realize it. And then if you keep going for that other mile, then you're just wearing things down. And again, not trying to fearmonger running, it is a great thing to do. I think that many people can do it and walk into it with some success, but just be cognizant of the idea that repetitive things are going to perhaps cause repetitive stress injuries. So if I'm going to get someone running, I want them to be able to develop their body. I want them to have the strength. I want them to have some degree of variability. I want them to train in all three planes. I want them to get out of what that repetitive pattern is. So I'm going to do things like lateral lunges. I'm going to do things like side planks. I'm going to do things like rotational movements where one arm's coming forward on a row, the other arm's coming back. They're moving their rib cage. Just things like that, just to get them a little bit of what they're not getting. And then they can go run. Maybe that can even be like 2 times a week at 30 minutes of lifting. And then you can do all the running that you feel like you're capable of doing. And that can go a long way. But ultimately, if we're only going to be stuck in this deconditioned pattern and maybe we've been sitting for 10 hours a day because we have a desk job and then we go run on top of that, I don't think that's the best possible strategy to minimize injuries and even maximize performance.
Right. Yeah, and I think running it's a very important topic, especially right now because a lot of gyms are closed. So I see a lot of people on Instagram posting a photo of their iPhone with the amount of kilometers they just ran. Like hey, I did the 10K, I did the 20K, 25K. But where would you say that there's diminishing returns in the sense that this person's gonna get injured if they run more? You know what I'm saying? Like, what are some signs that someone should be looking for while they're running that, like, okay, maybe I capped it out for today and I should just cut it?
So like during the run itself, or me just looking at a person?
Yeah, let's say someone says they're gonna run 10K and then 5K in, they're extremely exhausted and they don't know if they should keep going.
Yes.
And like the strides are getting a lot slower, they're a lot more out of breath. Like, what are some things they should be looking for? Not to slow them down, obviously, like not to demonize running, but to prevent injuries and stuff.
If they're dragging their feet on the ground, if they are no longer rotating their trunk and they are, huffing and puffing like with a wide open mouth, then I know that person is not able to maintain their current level. And what happens when you run is you accumulate oxygen debt. So that's why when you stop exercising, even on like a squat, you come away and you're panting or you're breathing faster because that's your body trying to catch up with all the waste products built up in your system from completing that movement. So you need to get more oxygen in to replenish your body. So if their mouth is wide open and they're not able to keep up their pace and it's dramatically worse and you can just kind of tell when someone's there, right? Their feet are turning out and it looks terrible. That's where they should probably cut it off, because at that point, unless it's a competition or some, extenuating circumstances, at that point, in my opinion, I think that is probably a time where not only are you not probably getting the best adaptations, you think like, yeah, if I push through this, I'll get better. Yeah, maybe you will, but also you might be using a different energy system more than you think you are, or you might not be getting like true the aerobic adaptations that you're looking for. And not only that, just think of it this way: if you push through that and then you potentially hurt yourself, or you tweak your knee a little bit or your ankle, then you're out for what, a couple weeks, then you just lost all that time. So in my opinion, it's not a risk worth taking, although I understand that it's very easy to say that, but in practice, like, we want to get better and we want to keep pushing through and we want to excel at what we're doing. So it's hard to do that in real life. But I think that degree of maturity in terms of training leads to better long-term success.
Mm-hmm. So after this is the last like athletic style question I'll ask is sprinting.
Sprinting.
I know that from the last Q&A you said you love sprinting too. Let's say you get someone day one, he just wants to run faster. It's not necessarily about being like a marathon runner and doing a 10K, but let's say he has a hill in his local park. He wants to just run up it faster than everybody else, you know. I guess it depends if we're talking about hill sprints, just sprints on flat ground. But for the sake of this example, let's just say hill sprints.
Yeah, I like hill sprints.
Yeah, for sure. And you can kind of get more out of less weight, you know. And they look badass.
Yeah.
But how would you go about improving somebody's sprinting abilities?
So I take the lens of, if I want to get bigger, I'm going to talk to a bodybuilder. If I want to get stronger, I'm going to talk to a powerlifter. If I want to get faster, I want to talk to a track coach, because that is where the expertise is. That's their specialty. They've been there. They have the experience themselves, and they've been coaching people through it. So if the first step, the best step is find a track coach and just ask them some questions, because they would know more about that than I do. But I do work with people. I train them to sprint. So like I am a strength and conditioning coach. That's something that I do. I would say have it start really easy. Start at 10 yards. And that's literally it. And then rest for a very long time. Go do something else. Do some positional work, like do some of the breathing exercises that I talk about. Find something productive to do that's not going to tax your system, because people think they can do repeat sprints, but that's how people get hurt a lot. That's how people, like, you know, you're not truly, it's all about quality. Sprints is all about quality. It's resting for a long time. That goes back to the resting thing I was talking about earlier. And it's all about maximizing the production of force. 10 yards is plenty for that, especially starting. Find a way to, I mean, like, it's so hard to give sprinting advice right off the bat to a beginner online, but I would say, look up some YouTube videos of Derek Hansen, of potentially a Darian Barr, people who have been in the trenches and been coaching these people for a very long time. But essentially, the idea behind sprinting is you want to spend the least amount of time on the ground, but you want to produce the most amount of force in that time. So 10-yard sprint accelerations are going to give you a good distance to where you can actually build up, but you're not going to be going so far because your mechanics aren't good enough yet to where you start to things start to fall apart.
Love it, man. Now, these are important questions because we're so used to hearing a lot of like these lifting style questions, but at the end of the day, we want our body, we want to have that variability. We want to do different things, you know, throw, jump, sprint. Right. So it's like, and I think a lot of times, especially people who are like in the bodybuilding world, not saying I am, but, you know, people want to look better. They want to be stronger. A lot of times they lose sight of that. And there's so many other realms of fitness that you should at least have like a decent idea about, you know.
Right.
If you're going to do it, might as well do it right, you know.
Yeah, I think it's like to each their own. If someone only wants to get big, then I think that's great. That's going to give them some great health benefits too. So I think there's nothing wrong with that. It's better than, you know, sitting on your ass and not doing anything all day, you know. So I think it's just do the minimum amount of work you need to do to keep your body mobile and have enough variability, quote unquote, and then just maximize your strengths. Just do the bare minimum. That's going to be different for everyone. I can't make a blanket statement, but it's going to be some degree of work. It can't be nothing. Or maybe you can do nothing and then you're rolling the dice, and that's, you know, people are adults here. That's their decision. But that would be my recommendation, is just find something where it's going to help you feel better afterwards, and it's going to help you feel like you're more mobile and you can get deeper ranges of motion than you have currently, and you can own that through a range of motion and a lift. That's wonderful. And I think just mixing it up every once in a while with our exercise selection too is a good way to go. Do some lateral lunges, right? Like do some oblique work, do some rotational work with bands, and that's going to go so far further than most people realize in terms of just longevity and training. And you can turn that stuff into, like a quad exercise or a glute exercise. You can still get a hypertrophy or strength response from that stuff. It's just in a little bit different of a fashion.
Right. So let's speak about assessments.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that it might vary from person to person, but so let's just put it this way. What are your thoughts on the overhead squat and the toe touch as like some basic assessments?
Yeah, I think the overhead squat is the most frankly misused test, and just it's not a good test. And I really do mean that, because what are you trying to assess on an overhead squat? You're trying to assess overhead mobility, you're trying to assess ankle range of motion, and you're trying to assess how deep you can get in a squat. So, and I can honestly tell you that if I measure those things in isolation on their own, there are so many ways to compensate through those. Just like lift your arm overhead. As soon as your arm starts to turn out, you've already maximized your shoulder flexion. So if you can't keep your palm perfectly in line, like you're slicing the air as you go up and you start to turn out, that's your end range. So when you're doing this overhead squat, it's just how much can you extend and arch your back and then drop into a squat a lot of the times. So even if one of those things is off, then it can be hard to know which of those things is off, first of all. But it's also just how well can you compensate to drop into an overhead squat? Because I can honestly tell you, I've worked with professional athletes who have overhead squatted. I've worked with college athletes who have overhead squatted. I've worked with powerlifters, bodybuilders, all that stuff. And the amount of range of motion you need to have to go into a nice looking, at least decent overhead squat, the amount of mobility you need to have and to own that is pretty significant. So I would rather look at those things in isolation and then use an overhead squat down the line as an assessment tool. But for someone in the first, I get someone off of the couch, I'm not going to look at an overhead squat for like a year, because why would I? It's just like I'm going to see how they compensate, not what their actual ranges of motion are,
right.
Like how much they can own a position. I'd rather look at those things through more simple movements, because that's going to tell me more and be more specific. As for the toe touch, I forgot that was the other half. The toe touch, that's not a hamstring test. It's measuring the ability of your pelvis to go into internal rotation. So for those that are watching, your pelvis, so you have the two halves of the pelvis for those that are listening. You have that bone in the middle underneath your vertebrae called the sacrum. Your sacrum needs to come forward and your pelvic bones need to come together, which is internal rotation and nutation of the sacrum. That needs to happen if you're going to touch your toes with locked out knees, which is how you should probably be doing it, because it's a pelvic test, it's not a hamstring test. You might feel your hamstrings in that test, be like, ooh, my hamstrings are just too tight. But that's not the case. Your hamstrings attach at the back of your pelvis, and they run down, and they attach somewhere around the back of your knees. So if your pelvis is forward to begin with, or you're someone who's not compressed and you're someone who's expanded and that sacrum bone tips back, and you don't have the ability to either further tip that sacrum forward and go into internal rotation, or you just can't do that to begin with, and your pelvis is forward, then your hamstrings, they're not the reason why you can't do it. Your hamstrings are already long. Every muscle should have a degree of slack. So imagine a rope, and that's your hamstring. If your pelvis is forward and it stays forward, you're taking up the slack out of that muscle. So it's stretched already. Then when you go down to touch your toes, it stretches more. So you're putting more stretch on a muscle that's already stretching while resting. So that is going to be like, wow, my hamstring is really limiting this. But no, it's just the starting position of your pelvis that's limiting it, and your inability to go into internal rotation. If you can do that, then your hamstrings aren't going to block you. But that's why people think it's like a hamstring assessment. Hamstring mobility, great. You'll have hamstring mobility if you can bring your pelvis back and then keep that muscle at a neutral length tension relationship, meaning you have slack in it where it's not too short, it's not too tight. Then it's not going to be, you don't have to overcome that tightness, whether they're too tight or whether they're too long in a resting state. In order to go and touch your toes, you would first have to overcome that. And that's very difficult, but it's because of the position of your pelvis and where your weight is in your feet, not because your hamstrings are loose or long, you need to stretch them out more. That's not
right. So you're saying regarding the overhead squat, and I've personally never given one, but I've seen a lot of it's a pretty hot topic, the overhead
Yeah.
squat assessment, like you see in CrossFit circles, different kind of circles. People will see, okay, let me see your overhead squat. And the way I kind of viewed it was a lot of people, let alone overhead squat, a lot of people have a lot of trouble just putting their arms overhead just to begin with. So
Yeah.
like, if we're talking about getting into a squat. So I definitely know what you mean there regarding like, let's break it up into different chunks.
Right.
So from your philosophy, would you do something like a squat assessment, see how well they could go up and down and squat, something like a toe touch, and then maybe something like a lying overhead, like see what their overhead mobility is like.
Right.
Would you do that?
So if I've got an athlete who has to overhead squat for their sport, for like a CrossFitter, and that's part of what they need to do, then I might actually use an overhead squat at first just to see what it looks like. But I'm not really going to be like, okay, I know exactly what we need to do here, because that's really hard to do from an overhead squat. But if it's specific to their sport, then yes, we need to probably incorporate that. But for most people, that's not the case. So why would we use that? I want to be hyper specific and understand exactly what the limitation is, so I can actually address the underlying cause, not the compensation, and then band-aid it up and then roll it out and be like, okay, you're good to go. But did that adaptation last? Probably not. The research says probably not if you're foam rolling or stretching it. Those adaptations, it's very murky whether those things actually last, and there's a lot of data that suggests they do not for more than a couple of minutes. So if I'm going to assess someone, I might just do a squat with them. Bodyweight squat, toes forward. And the reason why the toes are forward is that's going to tell me really what range of motion in your pelvis is. Because I can turn my toes way out and widen my feet way out and just drop my ass to grass, but that's not really like telling me what your pelvis is doing. So when you do a bodyweight,
is this barefoot? Sorry.
Barefoot, sure, or it can be with shoes on. It doesn't really matter.
Okay. No ramp though.
No ramp, right? Because a ramp allows them to get deeper. So what I'm going to do is just, show me your body weight squat, and you'll see one of two things 95% of the time. You'll see them, get down to about 90 degrees of hip flexion, thighs are parallel and they shoot their butt back. Or you'll see them naturally sit deeper into a squat and they're pretty much ass to grass. You'll see larger males, guys like you're probably going to stop at 90 degrees and push your butt back, because that's compression. That's where compression at 90 degrees of hip flexion, compression is maximized in your pelvis. So you stop there because you can't get any lower than that, because you can't decompress your pelvis. In order to go deeper than that, you have to start to go from a pelvis that's compressed to a pelvis that's expanded. So that sacrum bone I was talking about, it needs to go past 90 degrees of hip flexion. It's forward. It needs to tip back, and it needs to go back, and your pelvic bones need to expand outwards. So those that are more, it's a spectrum, right? So you got guys like you, then you have thinner females. Those ladies can always squat well. Those girls can squat because they have the ability, they're expanded rather than compressed. So they can squat deeper because their pelvis started at a different spot. But we will butt wink if we try to go lower than that, because if we're forward, then we're going to roll our pelvis underneath ourselves in an attempt to find that sacrum coming back, usually. There's other factors as well. I'm not trying to say this is always the case, but this is most frequently what I will see. That butt will roll under as an absolute unit together, because they can't find the separation within the movement within the pelvis itself of actually doing that opening up and expanding. Another reason why we need to both expand and compress.
Right. So while we're on the topic of squats, and I know that this is one of your first Instagram posts that I actually just found out like a couple weeks ago, about how lack of IR, internal rotation, could affect your squats.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an angle of squatting that I haven't heard that many people talk about, but it's true. If you lack a lot of IR, it's gonna be very hard to get into a squat. And I know this because that was the case with me. So
yeah. So think about this. Where do people's knees cave in on a squat? It's usually at the sticking point of a squat where it's hardest, right? That's somewhere around 90 degrees where your thighs are parallel to the ground. And what did I just say about 90 degrees? That's where compression is maximized. When I say compression, I mean internal rotation, adduction, and extension going on in your pelvis. So your pelvic bone, your sacrum comes forward, your pelvic bones come together. That is maximum compression at 90 degrees. So if you don't have that internal rotation, lots of powerlifters have external rotation because they've compensated into it because they need that to squat. So if you don't have that internal rotation, then your knee is going to cave in, because the body, again, takes the path of least resistance, least amount of calories, most amount of results. The knee caves in because that knee is trying to find internal rotation that your pelvis and femur, your thigh bone, do not have. So what's the path of least resistance? Have the knee go in because your pelvis cannot. And that happens usually around 90 degrees parallel of hip flexion. And then you see that knee valgus and that knee collapse. So people might be like, put a band around your knees. And then they'll push their hips out really, really wide, right, to solve that. And I think that can be valid if you keep your knees in lines with your toes. But if you're jamming your knees out, which so many people do in that situation, you're turning on your glutes a lot when you do that. And your glutes need to elongate as you go deeper into a squat. When you come out of the hole, your glutes need to work concentrically. They need to tighten up and propel you upwards. But if you're going to be propelling yourself upwards with your glutes as you go downwards, you're just going to arch your low back and extend. Your knees might go out, but I doubt you get lower than 90 degrees because you're just doing a concentric action during the eccentric lowering part of the movement. So keeping the knees over the toes is a good way, actually. Let's say that person can't hit squat depth and they're really compressed, to expand them into more external rotation within their pelvis and allow them to get deeper. You want to elevate their heels and you want them to keep a band around their knees a lot of times, probably not during their heavy sets and reps, but maybe like a warm up, like a goblet squat with their heels elevated, band around the knees, or afterwards in their accessory work. That will allow their pelvis to open up, and then that sort of heel ramp will allow them to get that sacrum to come back, which is going to allow them to actually drop deeper into the squat. So that heel ramp, that's what that's doing. It's just allowing you to access more expansion in that sacrum coming backwards, which will allow you to not butt wink and drop deeper into the squat.
Right. But when you say band around the knees, we're obviously not fighting the band to like resist.
No,
we just have it
knees
there.
over the toes. Yeah.
Right. As a reference tool.
Exactly.
Okay. So on the topic of knees, and about how I spoke about, we're going to talk about the ACL surgeries. So what are some strategies or some training methods or just anything overall that we could do to prevent our athletes from tearing an ACL? I know you're a big advocate of hamstrings, variability. But what are some of your go-to methods so this doesn't happen?
There's a lot of things you can do, but the thing that our field, fitness and strength conditioning, the thing we're worst at is predicting injuries. It's so hard. There's so many factors that go into it. Like, for example, in the 2008 Olympics, they did like a little study, and the athletes that were anxious about injury or illness before their competition were 5 times more likely to be injured. So it's not like it's all biomechanical. There's so many psychological influences that go into this. It's impossible to predict, but you can make it more or less likely. So things you can do is, that's why I think plyometrics are important. Can you absorb that force? If you can't, RG3 is a great example of this. Dude is completely derailed his career because of those ACLs. So when RG3 would go to jump, and when he would land, and when he would run, you would see his knees cave in. So everyone was like, it's the knees. It's that knee valgus. That's what's causing his ACL tear. But that's a very myopic, that's a very like isolated viewpoint. Why is his knees caving in? Well, it's because he's compressed and he can't expand and he can't absorb the force. So he's using this extremity, this leg-driven strategy to absorb the force. His knees are absorbing the force that the rest of his body cannot. So it's the path of least resistance again. So I want people to be able to expand. If I want someone to be able to, minimize injuries, I want them, with ACL specifically, I want them to be able to absorb the force. I want them to have strong hamstrings. People are biased towards anterior pelvic tilt. That's why you see so many posture things of, this is how you get rid of anterior pelvic tilt. It's because it's so common, because humans are always trying to go forward. So if we're trying to go forward, everyone's trying to go forward in this whole planet one way or another. So if you're trying to go forward all the time and you don't have the ability to do that naturally, then your pelvis dumps forward. There's a lot of other reasons why we do that too, when it comes to our breathing and everything. But if everything is going forward, then your quads are going to be dominant, your hamstrings are going to be weak. But your hamstrings need to decelerate a lot of that force that you absorb when you land or when you strike the ground when you're running. They need to act to slow you down in some degree. But if you can't do that, then your knee might go all over the place. So I care about hamstrings. I care about the ability to absorb force. I care about the ability to have control in the frontal plane. So if that knee, I don't want that. I want you to have the ability to have strong outer hip musculature, like your glute med, for example, needs to be pretty strong. And there's so many things that go into that as well. Like, do you even have a sense of the ground, right? People need to be able to, like, there's so many proprioceptors, so many things that sense the ground in our feet. And if we've always been wearing shoes or we've always been training in a way where our feet can't sense the ground and don't have a relationship with it, then that can be detrimental. So shoe wear is big. And I'm not saying train barefoot all the time. I'm just saying there's things that go into a shoe. And I've posted about this before. If people want to check that out or message me about it. But shoe wear is important. But ultimately, it's, do they have the ability to have that variability that they need? Do they have the ability to expand and compress? And I keep saying that, it's like a broken record, but it really does come down to that a lot of the times. And some people need more of that. Some people need less of that. Sometimes you might see the other end of the spectrum. Let's say we have a female, one of those thinner females that are prone towards expansion more. They might, because their pelvis is opened, whereas guys like you and me, our pelvis is closed, their pelvic bones, the innominate bones kind of go out to the side more, whereas ours go in. When it goes out to the side, that pelvic floor drops. And your pelvic floor is basically like a ring of musculature at the bottom of your pelvis. It needs to be able to drop and your guts come down when you absorb force, when you go deep into a squat. And then in order to propel yourself and produce force, you need to go into that compression and you need to be able to ascend that pelvic floor, which acts as a trampoline, because when those innominate bones go in, the pelvic floor ascends and it's like a spring and it shoots your guts up. But if you can't find that, then your knees might cave in, because when your knees cave in, that's fake internal rotation, which shoots your guts up, which will help you spread apart your pelvic floor. And that's one way that can happen. So for females, it's really a lack of ability to produce force and find that internal rotation in the first place.
Right. And not to talk about like the whole male female debate, but I've read in a couple, I don't know how legitimate these theories or statements are, but they were saying in one article how, I forgot which article it was 2016, how a lot of females tend to be more susceptible to ACL surgeries. And is that true?
Yeah, you do see that. I think, I'm not going to get this number right, but I think not only are they more susceptible to tearing them in the first place, but they're also, I think, 70 something or 80 something percent, I don't know, it's something well above 60% of females who tear that ACL are that much likely to tear either their other or same side ACL within 2 years. That's because ACL rehab, it's come a long way, but it's still not the best. And number two, there's so many factors and there's so many debates and there's no clear answer. But what we do know is that strength training and being strong and having a degree of hamstring and quad and outer hip and abdominal strength is going to factually reduce your overall risk. And that's pretty much the only thing we can say with a fair degree of confidence is, do you have those things? If you do, because that's what we studied so much, then you're statistically less likely to tear your ACL as both a male and female, but especially female.
Wow. So let's speak about elbows, because in the last Q&A, you spoke about how proximal stability equals distal mobility. Actually, no, you didn't even talk about that in the last Q&A, but I think I
say that all the
from your
time.
course. Yeah. You probably brought it up in like an Instagram post. So now, given that statement, let's talk about elbow pain, because a lot of times you'll hear people talking about how my elbow hurts, therefore it must be coming from the elbow. So they'll do like, I don't know, band push downs as a warm up, whatever the case is. So the question is, from a lot of the lifters that you've worked with who've had elbow pain, where could it come from? Where are other places it could come from? Like, does it creep up to the shoulders?
Yeah.
Or is there something going on in the upper, or what?
So what I see most of the time with elbow pain, and yeah, if you're like doing a lot of skull crushers and tricep work, you're putting some stress on that elbow. Maybe you just need to back off and you'll be okay if you just give it a little rest. But what I see most commonly is if you're going to be compressed, like guys like you and me, then our scapula is going to not be able to glide on the back rib cage. So there has to be a degree. Your scapula is a rounded structure. It needs to sit on a. You guys ever seen a picture of a normal human spine curve? Arches in the low back. It sort of reverse arches in the upper back, and then it arches again in the neck. So imagine that S. If you don't have that mid portion of the S where your thoracic spine mid back rounds outward as opposed to inward, then your scapula, which is a rounded structure, can't glide on that rib cage. So the scapula might find a way to find stability, so it might tip inwards if you're compressed, because that compressed is an exhaled state. So where the scapula comes in, which is exhalation. So your humerus might go into external rotation where it turns out. Then you might overcorrect at your forearm, and your forearm might turn into pronation. So you have a scapula that can't glide on a rib cage. So your humerus turns some outward or inward. And then to find stability, so not everything is going outward or inward, your forearm turns against that. So then you have torque at your elbow. And it works very similarly at your knee too. And that is not the only thing. That is by no means the only way this happens. But in my experience and opinion, this is what's going to happen. We can't just look at the elbow. We got to understand what the elbow is attached to. The elbow is attached to the humerus, your upper arm bone, which is attached to your shoulder blade, which is attached to your rib cage. So if you're going to be compressed, then you're not going to be able, unless you've worked on it, to access those other ranges of motion and allow your scapula to glide freely. So we need to look at this, but we also need to look at your elbow. Maybe we can do some isolated elbow stuff. But let's also not forget the bigger picture.
Right. So what are some takeaways that a lifter who has elbow pain could potentially take away? Like,
go do
what
some
can
of
he
that
add to his training right now?
Yeah, go do some of that all four
breathing.
breathing. Get in a sideline position on the ground, and then kind of like, how do I describe this? Get in a sideline position on the ground with your feet against the wall, and then sort of just hike up your hip. So if I'm laying on my left side, I kind of do like a side bend to the left, so my spine is neutral and it's not kind of sagging down. And then just breathe in that position. I would lie on my left side and I would feel my left abs, and then I would just sit there and tuck my hips underneath, posteriorly tilt. And then I would breathe, because gravity is then pushing down on you, which is a much bigger factor than people believe. Then it's easier for people like you and me to breathe in a sideline position than it is to breathe in a supine position with our back on the ground, because we're already compressed front to back. We have flattened out like a pancake. So if we flip on our sides and breathe there and feel some abs, we can get the expansion, and we can restore that flexion, that little curve into our thoracic spine, which will allow our scapula to glide more freely. And that's not the only thing that we would do here, but I'm just trying to give some ideas of how you could go about this problem. And I would address that breathing, address the ability to expand back there. So try both of those exercises and just hang out, stay relaxed, and feel that expansion in your rib cage. I have plenty of videos on my YouTube channel which talk about that.
And I would assume that if a lot of these elbow issues would also creep into the wrists, potentially the fingers as well.
It could.
Right. Okay, so in the last Q&A, we spoke on stretches, spoke on foam rolling, all that good stuff. Well, not good stuff according to you, but anyway. You often hear that if somebody wants to improve their front rack, so they could do cleans, they could do front squats, they could do maybe push presses, that they should be doing some kind of stretches. Maybe their lats are tight. You hear that often, you know?
Yeah.
And the argument makes sense, because maybe if we could, foam roll our lats, loosen them up, get our elbows a little higher without having to extend as much. What are some ways that you like to improve one's front rack position?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, I think stretching works. It does, because that's how people have improved their front rack position for so long. That's why it's recommended, because it does provide those benefits. But do those benefits stick? Why is it that you have to do that before you front squat every single time, right? Why is that? It's because you're loosening it up, but then you're immediately going into exercises that are compressing it. Really, the best way to improve your front rack position is do more front squats, and then you will adapt to that imposed demand on your body, and you will probably get better over time. But sometimes you're so tight that you need to do something, and stretching can be a very good way to do that. But I think there's potentially a better way for some people. And that is to think why those lats are tight. Why are they limiting your ability to get your arms up, which is shoulder flexion? Well, your scapula needs to ride on your rib cage for that to happen. And that goes back to exactly what I said about elbow pain. If your scapula can't glide on your rib cage and then go through the range of motion it needs to on that back rib cage, then you're not going to be able to move your arm to that range of motion. So if we were able to clear that up and potentially do those breathing exercises and maybe some more isolated things, I have plenty of stuff on my Instagram and Twitter about that as well, then you can improve that range of motion and restore more movement into your rib cage, which is feeding everything down the chain and up the chain. Then you can actually address the root problem, as opposed to having to do 5 minutes of lat stretches every day. Maybe you use that 5 minutes to do these positional drills and then facilitate the right positions, expand the right areas, and then you're going to unlock some other things too besides just your lats. You're going to unlock the ability for you to keep a more neutral pelvis. You're going to unlock the ability for you to feel your abs more. You're going to unlock the ability for yourself to have more hip range of motion if you do those things. You're going to see that time and time again. So I think just in terms of bang for your buck, if you want to stretch, go stretch. And if it's working for you, maybe don't fix it if it's not broken. But if you want something that could potentially give you more bang for your buck, I would consider these things.
Right. And you also say it could be potentially be longer lasting as well.
Yeah, it's consistency, right? So if you're going to go do these exercises, then go compress yourself and not do anything else, probably not going to last, just like stretching. But if you do them consistently and you have some degree of variability in your training, then yeah, they're probably going to last for quite a bit longer. Okay.
So now regarding the left AIC, a lot of people aren't familiar with this issue, or I don't even know if you want to call it an issue, but this asymmetry. They're not familiar with that, but they are familiar with, they may not even with the other one, but a lot of people are familiar with the anterior pelvic tilt. And then people talk about the lateral pelvic tilt. It's like, okay, that makes sense. So what's the big difference between a left AIC and a lateral pelvic tilt?
So lateral pelvic tilt being like the pelvis is turned to one side?
Right. And okay. I know that I think it was Neil who made a post about that, how there is no such thing as lateral pelvic tilt because it means it's not just the pelvis, there's other stuff going on, but
yeah. So your pelvis moves, your SI joint moves very, very little, but I'm going to exaggerate it on the video so that people can see it. So because we have these asymmetries, like I said, the brain, the diaphragm, the organs, all these things are pushing us into the right side. So our pelvis becomes more posteriorly tilted on the right, more anteriorly tilted on the left. So it comes forward like that, which is a slight exaggeration. Now, because of that, we're better able to load our right hip because of that force plate. Just as an example, those force plates are a good example of that, what happens in a squat or a deadlift. So the spine rotates to the left so you don't walk in a circle to the right, because if everything was going to the right, you would want to walk in a circle to the right. And there's been some studies done in 2006, 2007 that showed because of this organ asymmetry, there is a natural, non-compensatory rightward lower spine orientation in human beings. This was observed objectively. And up top, there is a leftward rotation. This is why you see more people's right shoulders lower than their left. If they have a lower left shoulder, they have compensated again, and they have reoriented that trunk back to the right because maybe they're going too far left now. So it's all just fighting gravity. Because if you're too far to the right, you're going to find a way to go to the left. You're too far left, you're going to find a way to go to the right. So it's just like this kind of stack that just changes as you go up and down the chain. Just like you see anterior pelvic tilt, that's just a body's attempt to best manage gravity. Maybe that person feels like they're falling too far backwards, so they tip their pelvis forward. And then maybe you find another compensation somewhere else. So maybe up top, they're falling too far forward in their pelvis, so you see that flat thoracic spine, you see them arch their back a bunch because they're falling too far forward in their pelvis. And the compensation is to come back in your upper body. So it's all just your body trying to, self-organize into the path of least resistance. It's all just your body analyzing your current range of motion, your current strength, your current, your past injuries and past trauma to your tissues. And then it's saying, what is the safest position for me to be in right now? And then that's where it's going to go.
Mm-hmm. But do you ever use that term, the lateral pelvic tilt, or not even?
I don't. I just say, because most people don't know these anatomical terms, I just say your pelvis is turned to the right a little bit. And there's nothing wrong with that. It benefits us to be asymmetrical because we're naturally alternating creatures. We go from internal rotation and compression on one side to external rotation and compression on the other side. Whatever's going on one side of the body, usually the opposite is happening on the other. So it benefits us to be able to go from side to side and have a starting point to do that from. Watch MMA fighters. Watch NFL wide receivers. Which foot is usually in front before they go and start running? It's their left, because that is the pelvic orientation where people feel comfortable. That's their left pelvis ahead of their right. That's comfort.
Mm-hmm. I know my left foot toe is in front of the right.
Yeah.
Okay, so as far as, give me maybe 2 or 3 lifts, poorly done lifts that you only started realizing as of recently. I know you mentioned the lateral raise on your Instagram a couple weeks ago, but
in terms of just general people?
Yeah, just general gym lifts,
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think overhead pressing is the most butchered exercise because people want to overhead press, but they naturally have a very limited ability to have that overhead flexion. So they're going to compensate and arch their low back because the amount of shoulder flexion you need to have to properly do an overhead press is the same kind of it's similar to an overhead squat where it's you need a lot and to not compensate, man, you got to work at that. So the overhead press is something I just don't program unless an athlete is insisting on it or they need it for their sport. If they're a powerlifter, they're probably going to need to overhead press most of the time. If they're a strongman, they probably need to overhead press. So unless it's necessary for their sport, I don't think you have to do any exercise. Something else I see that's often butchered, and this is more individual, is a lateral lunge. So someone will take a huge step out to the side and then push their butt back and then, their knees over their toe. And that's good. You want to actually keep your knee over the toe in some situations. But if you want to really recruit your glutes, then what you want to do is take a smaller step out. And you want to keep your big toe on the ground with your heel. And you want your knee to abduct and turn out. So you want your knee to go past your little toe a little bit. And then you want to keep that big toe flat. That's the tricky part. So in order to do that, you need to take a more shallow step out. But what people do is they just turn into this sagittal plane exercise. You're not really working your lateral hips that much if you're just stepping out and there's no real frontal plane or transverse plane rotational action. So if they can do that, you'll be amazed at how much more glutes you feel, how much more side of the hips you feel, glute need. But again, it needs to be individualized, and I can't make blanket statements for everyone because for some people, they actually might want to keep that knee in line with the toe so they're not potentially compressing the backside of their pelvis with their glutes so much, because some people don't need that. But other people would benefit from it. So it's so individual. That's why exercise selection matters and these little details matter, because you can't just – I don't write just here's a program and roll with it, because I know and I try to appreciate how individual things can be, and whether you're in one end of the expansion, one end of the compression spectrum, I'm going to want to individualize it so I'm not pushing you too far into where you already are.
Mm-hmm. I know you made a post on the lateral lunge too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you usually see people just do that, big step out. And at that point, that's not a real frontal plane exercise. That's kind of like a fake frontal plane exercise, but it can be used.
What about the Cossack squat? What about that?
Yeah, that's kind of similar. You're sitting deep into that hip, and that's great. Probably a good mobility exercise if you're trying to own that range of motion and work through it. and open up your groin. But again, I would need to know who I'm working with and whether that's appropriate for them or not. So for example, if those adductors, those groin muscles are already stretched out because of the position of their pelvis, do I want to drive that home more? Probably not.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you believe in that isn't backed up by science? I know within the course I'm taking by you, pretty much every slide has a handful of sources of where you got some of the information from. Was there anything that you believe right now that isn't like backed up by anything and just kind of like your own theory?
Maybe one thing small, but for the most part, no, because really, like, the human body is the human body. Like, we're not reinventing the wheel when we come up with these systems or new approaches to things. We're only just seeking how to understand the body, what's always been there as far as we've been doing fitness, really, for forever. We have not been around long enough for the body to evolve to the point where we have to work with a new, animal that is ourselves, right? We're still human beings. So anything we do to get better working with the human body is just understanding it better and what it does. So yeah, I want to be grounded in science and things that are actual factual, because if I make things up, then I'm not actually working with the human body. I'm just trying to impose my own definition onto it. I'm not going to get good outcomes. But the one thing I do sometimes do, but I think it makes sense logically, but I have no data to back this up, is after a training session, I'm going to have someone go into a breathing exercise, and they're just going to breathe slowly and controlled. And they're going to just basically do that diaphragmatic breathing, and they're going to down regulate their system, because I think that better kickstarts the recovery process, because recovery is parasympathetic rest and digest branch of our nervous system. When we're competing, when we're lifting under load, we are sympathetic. That's fight or flight. And we better be if we're going to lift that weight. But if we're always stuck in that sympathetic state, where we have that back arch, where we're puffing out our chest all the time. Right. Our brain is always to some degree sensing a threat. Like, just puff out your chest right now, you immediately feel more alert. Even if you're sitting or standing, you feel more awake. So imagine that was going on a little bit 24/7. I want to help spend a minute or 2 minutes, couple of breathing drills, down regulate them, get them more parasympathetic, and then boom, they're off. I think that makes sense, but I have zero data to back that up.
I could have sworn that was backed up though.
I don't know. Like, I know that kind of breathing will down regulate the system and make it more parasympathetic. That's factual, 100% grounded in science. But does that make the recovery process that much better? I have no idea, but I would imagine it does.
The way you and Rich explained it to me, man, I could have sworn it was but even if there's not one single piece of paper, it doesn't matter,
Right. And I've found good success with it, and I think it makes sense based off of all the principles I follow, so I do it.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap up in a few. So what are your thoughts on eye exercise? Because you hear about this, like, it's a pretty I don't want to say controversial topic, but there's some videos on YouTube floating around talking about eye exercises and closing one eye and like looking in different directions and having one finger here and doing like things of that nature. Right. What are your thoughts on these? And I'm aware that everything is a tool in the toolbox, and you use the right tool for the right job, and you know that these are the tools I have at my disposal, and some of them you may not even touch once in your life, or maybe not even refer them once to anybody. But let's just say, for example, you're aware that you have this tool of eye exercises. Mm-hmm. Have you ever implemented it with anybody?
Yeah, usually people that are very unstable. The visual system, and 2% actually, fun fact, of your balance is in your teeth, which is crazy because your teeth help ground you. And I've tweeted about that if people want to dig into that. But a lot of your vision is dominated by your feet on the ground and your eyes. Why do people look down when they walk? That helps them find stability. So something people can do is take their finger, put right in front of their face, about a foot away, and then keep your head perfectly still and just have your eyes go diagonally. Watch your finger before it turns into 2, and then go diagonal up in one direction, to the right, diagonal down, and then drag it all the way across your face to the other side, and then up again. One of those things is going to feel way more strenuous, or significantly more strenuous, than the other 3. And that is where your eyes are probably most limited in your field of vision. For me, it's up and to the right. I really struggle to do that without straining my eyes. So I know that I feel most unstable there. So if you were to put me in a split squat position and have me look at that corner, at like maybe a fixed object or maybe something that's moving, would be even harder because that's even less stable. Then I'm going to have to find the ground better. And hopefully you've got a coach that could, or you have the knowledge to be able to do this with yourself to actually maintain a good position as you do that. That's going to help ground people better. But that's not the first step. Like I'm going to look at the easy low hanging fruit first. I'm going to look at their shoes. I'm going to look at, how much can you even stand on one leg, right? And then maybe we'll throw the vision stuff in there. Yeah. So like, I think it's a great tool, and I can go really deep into theories about that. But I don't have any science or data to back it up. So I try not to. It's just things I think about, but I think that plays a big role in field athletes and athletes in general. So the vision stuff is great. And like you said, it's a tool, but ideally we would want people to be able to access the ability to go through all of those range of motions in their eye and those different corners and not feel strained when they do that, because that means they can be comfortable there. One other thing is like saccades, where you have, two objects like a finger or just two things and you're quickly switching between them. Athletes need to be able to do that. Imagine you're running and your quarterback throws you the ball and you need to pick that ball quickly up out of space in the sky. Mm-hmm. You need to be able to switch your eyes to that quickly and make a rapid decision and then orient your hands in space to catch that ball. So that's why that needs to train as well. And I would do that if I had athletes who need to catch things. So I think, the vision thing is huge. But ultimately, I want people to keep their eyes up when they're training. But it's amazing. Even when people keep their eyes up, they can't even move them when they're lifting. They have to stay so stable. They need to look at something on the wall, like pick a spot and look at it. And hey, maybe that's a good tool if you're trying to lift the most amount of weight possible. But again, what are the secondary consequences of that?
So you think So what do you recommend when somebody's lifting? For example, they shouldn't pick a spot on the wall. They should the eye should be more free.
Yeah, this is like getting into giving people too many things to think about, probably. But if someone's got, significant instability issues in a squat or a deadlift or like a single leg exercise, then I'm going to start to look at that. Like if I have addressed all the low hanging fruit, like their shoes, their position of their skeleton and muscles, and then if I still don't have anything, they're unstable, I'm going to look upstairs and see what's going on with their vision.
Right. Well, I understand if somebody's like, they lack like the grounding from the lower body department. So then they just, they start looking down to kind of like rely more on their visual system. But what if the person does have their head more up and they're just looking at the wall and they're picking one spot?
I think that's okay. Okay. That's all right? So I'm not going to demonize that at all, because I think that's fine. And if that helps them lift more weight and accomplish their goals, then so be it. I don't think that's something that people should be worried about, only if it's like, man, there's a lot going on there. And you would need someone probably smarter and more experienced than me to look at that and kind of like give an analysis and diagnosis.
Because I remember when I was listening to you and Neil, great Q&A, by the way. Actually, I heard Neil talk about this like a couple months ago, where if you take someone who does a split squat, you'd be amazed to see how many people are just looking at the ground, just to kind of find some grounding and stability. And I was definitely one of those people, back in the day when I would like try to go so heavy on like, Bulgarian split squats, just different split squat variations. I always looked at the ground for the most. And if I wasn't looking at the ground, I would like look up for a second and look back down. Yeah. And I noticed I could, with the way that I'm doing like my reverse lunges now and, split squat variations now in like a Zercher style, whatever, I'm definitely not as strong when I look at the wall.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Flies everywhere, man.
It's all about stability, man.
Yeah.
It's all about stability.
So, but with that being said, even though I'm not as strong when I look at the wall, there's more carryover to the real world, So I'm walking around like everyday life. I'm not looking at the ground. I want to be alert up here. So just 2 questions left. What are some other things that people could... Okay. I'll wrap it up right now.
Yeah, this is awesome, but I literally have someone coming.
We're past the time limit. Yeah. So anyways, man, to everybody who made it past this point, you guys are the real MVPs. Really appreciate it. This is Conor Harris, and I'm really happy he took the time out of his day to hop on the Q&A. So
Man, Phil, it's always good talking to you, my friend. Always.
Yeah. We're way overdue, man, but way over the time limit, but it's all good, man.
All right, Phil. Take care, man. I appreciate you.
So much. Take care.
See you, man.